Okay, I'll do it. I'll finally do it. I reviewed 7 of the mainline Mega Man X titles, but left the last one in limbo. I was accused of avoiding this one, and you know what? That is absolutely correct. I despise X6 with a passion. The only time I previously beat it, it broke me, and I was only able to clear it by learning how to cheese things with the only armor set that I actually liked, and I knew if I were to give this game a proper summary, I would need to do at least 2 more attempts, which, to me, could be considered a form of self-harm. When I skipped this one to go back to the classic series, it was the defense mechanism, but I can't run from this forever. I finally gave it 2 more goes, one with X and one with Zero, and while I can't say I love to learn X6, I'm at least ready to talk about it and hope that it's at least a little therapeutic. I'm Wes, the explosion, and blah blah blah, let's get this over with. This one's story is a bit of a mess, partly due to bad translation, partly because this title was completely unnecessary. The X series ended with X5 with 3 different endings, though this one takes place after the one where, after Sigma's colony drop, Zero sacrifices himself for X, and X is, in turn, allowed to remember Zero and keep his saber. Things open with a Reploid scientist, Gate, sifting through the wreckage of the impact site, finding a piece of Zero, and giggling to himself. Soon after, a purple ghost of Zero appears at an incident that X is responding to, quickly leaves, then a powerful Reploid named High Max shows up to investigate, emasculate X, and then leave after telling him to get lost. Then another scientist, Isaac, shows up to play Doomsday Prophet, declares Zero the Antichrist, and asks for volunteers to investigate these purple Zero nightmares, sending out 8 recently revived Reploids to lead the expedition. X doesn't take kindly to people blaming his best dead bud for the world's woes and sets off to investigate himself, coming into conflict with these lead investigators as he does so. Or at least I think that's the gist of it. Like I said, it's not translated the best, and I don't feel compelled to look up a plot summary, given what the game does with the supporting cast. Cygnus and Douglas make very few appearances, largely being off-screen, and the life givers are just plain missing. Zero died, and yet if you beat an optional boss, he comes back, saying that he hid until he could repair himself. I was there, dude. All 3 paths, and in none of them were the injuries you suffered things that you could just sleep off. Dear Lord, let the guy rest. If you absolutely needed this game to happen, you could have had the new support characters from the last game be the ones to back X up, instead of largely shelving everyone outside of Alia and bringing back Zero with an excuse so lazy that it makes the plot of X2, where they stuck him back together with spit and duct tape, seem downright inspired. People seem to like Gate, so maybe a proper explanation would make the rest of the plot palatable, but with such narrative blasphemy baked in, I can't be bothered to see the nuance in his and his associates' characters. And Isaac is not Wily. This game already screws up so much, I'm not even humoring the possibility of them touching upon him. Use Sergi's, Wheel, or even Master Albert if you need somebody for that role, Isaac is just Gate's puppet. X is X. He can jump, dash, charge his buster, and if he doesn't have a special weapon equipped, you can press the secondary weapon button to have him swing the Z-Saber instead. And once again, he starts out with an armor set, X5's Falcon armor, though it's been severely nerfed. While not strong offensively, it could fly freely through the air for quite a while, with a damaging buffer in front to protect him from not being knocked out of the sky. This time, it still has its pea shooter, but its aerial mobility is largely gone. Still, the armor does let you charge specials and has a pretty nice AoE Giga attack, a super move that refills as you take damage, so it's probably better than running around in the nude. Then there's the blade armor. It has an okay sized charge shot, but you can also use it for a more powerful sword strike if you're up close instead. Its Giga attack throws 2 shockwaves from your sword straight ahead, which ain't bad for a crowded hallway. The main attraction with this is the air dash. Press dash in the air, and when you release the button, you'll fly in whichever direction you're holding, with a few iframes at the start. It goes much further than the typical air dash, and being able to aim it in 4 directions instead of just 2 is huge. Of course, this might have been why they nerfed the Falcon armor, since free flying would have eclipsed a good bit of the blade's ability. And lastly, there's Shadow armor. I actually really like this one. X dons some ninja-themed duds that make him immune to spikes and able to cling to walls, heck, even flip upside down to sit on the ceiling. Its basic attack is to just fling some shuriken at random angles in front of you, which isn't terribly helpful, but his charge shot is a pretty meaty swing of the sword. This does a good job of slapping around most bosses, including High Max, and its Giga attack, which sends 2 crescents looping around X, are second to none for shredding single targets. Sigma who? This armor can't use any special weapons, but I rarely find myself wanting to use any in this game, so I don't think it's a big deal. This is what I beat my first run with, though I needed to get some extra abilities to prolong my airtime since I didn't have an air dash to clear the second gate stage. And you need the blade armor to get the shadow unless you know some sort of cheese, so no deciding that you're only going after this set. Like in X5, you need all the parts of each to actually use either, no mixing and matching or partial builds. Back to those weapons though, like I said, they don't really do much for me. A rotating barrier that fires is kind of interesting for the EMR option. A reflector shield with the guard shell can be helpful, and using the ice burst to create a block to jump on is neat, but the rest are all just kind of projectiles that fire out at various angles, with pretty much all the powered up versions being either the same thing but bigger or an AoE attack. A lot of weapon rosters in X do the same thing though, so it's not horrible, I just typically get more use out of the armor sets and don't bother with them. Like I said, beat an optional boss and unlock Zero. He's got his sword, which he swings around a bit differently this time, and a buster, though this fires only one kind of shot, which takes about a half second to use, can't be charged, and can only be fired when grounded, but options are nice. Rather than gaining a new skill that's incorporated directly into his moveset when you beat a boss, like in the past, here, half of them do that, half of them are just the special weapon with an ammo count that function pretty much the same way they do for X. Since the double jump and air dash come standard for Zero this time, it's not the biggest deal, but it still feels a little lackluster. Like they could only come up with half the special skills needed this time and they just decided to port over X weapons for the rest. Definitely prefer how they handled him in X4 and X5, but I just like those two more on the whole, so that could be clouding my judgment a bit. Either way, he doesn't play terribly, and since the game will crowd you with enemies a lot, being able to just spam your saber to shake them off, especially when you get the air spin, can be a very viable playstyle. We continue the trend of 2 sub-tanks, 1 weapons tank, and 1 EX tank. Sub-tanks you fill up with extra health to be used at a later date of your choosing. The weapon tank is the same but with ammo, and the EX tank starts you off with an extra 2 lives upon starting a level. While the others are still good, the last one is kinda pointless. Not only does this game give you a ton of extra lives, but getting a game over will give you the option to continue or go to the stage select, and if you do choose the former, it starts you back at your last checkpoint, almost like if you had more lives in reserve. Thus, your only punishment for losing is having to navigate a menu, but again, having extra lives mean that you don't have the option of choosing a different stage. The last game did this too, so I can't lay the blame at X6's feet, and some stages are such a pain that needing to do the whole thing over again would be unbearable, but the way they do things just seems stupid. Get rid of lives and just give an anytime stage exit, and while some may say it makes things too easy, at least it wouldn't feel like you programmed something pointless in because it felt like you were supposed to. There are other power-ups besides the tanks though. There are these weird, DNA-looking enemies scattered throughout the levels that drop nightmare souls upon defeat. Grab them before they revive to collect them, and gathering enough will raise the number of chips you can equip. You can get chips for X, chips for Zero, and chips for both, and they do stuff like upgrade your speed or jumping ability, or give you a full health refill, to name a few. There are also Reploids you can rescue throughout the stages. You can only get each one once, and while they all refill some health, some give you bonuses, like extra lives, expanded health, and the aforementioned chips. And since drops are assigned to each, if you have something specific you're searching for, you can look up a location to find what you want. Both times I cleared it with X, I did so using armors that shouldn't have worked for some of the end levels, but by looking up an FAQ and putting together a specific loadout, I was able to do the impossible. Thank you, Google. These Reploids can also be corrupted by the Nightmare DNA enemies and turned against you, so getting to rescues before they do can be pretty important. X6 has the worst stage design of any Mega Man game. There, I said it. The best of these levels are mediocre, and the absolute worst feel like punishment for some manner of grievous sin. The intro and Yanmark stage are alright. Wouldn't make my list of favorites, but at least I can tolerate them. Shield Sheldon's has a nice gimmick, you needing to manipulate some mirrors to bounce a laser into a door. I'd probably like this stage in another entry, but here, I get just kinda bored waiting for the lasers to reset when I have to bait them. Ground Scarovich has you going through hallways that it chooses randomly, meaning you need to get lucky and possibly grind out trips to get some upgrades from this level, and several of them have way too many hazards in them, to the point of feeling claustrophobic. Infinity Maginians also does the way too much on screen thing, but it gets a pass because I have a soft spot for giant robots. Blizzard Wolffangs has a lot going on, with falling avalanches that you can hide from, though they go on for way too long, pits where you have to use falling ice blocks to climb out of, though you're not allowed to skip it even if you clear said pit before the challenge starts, and rows of falling ice blocks that you have to thread the needle on, you taking damage if they fall on you, and just instantly dying if you don't jump through the gap in time. The thing that really gets me about the last one is there are Reploids that you can rescue to refill your health, but they don't respawn, so you can screw this part up pretty easily for yourself. The stage feels like the sort of thing that's manageable if you're familiar with it, but super frustrating if you're either new to the game or just out of practice. Rainy Turtloid has you looking for small bits to advance when your vision is partially obscured by rain, and if you happen to miss one, it can lead to a lot of aimless running around. Blaze Heatnix has you fighting the same, ugly, boring looking sub-boss 5 times, with some of the encounters making it very hard to get access to its glowing green pimples without a screen wiping attack. And seriously, when have you ever fought a sub-boss that you wanted to fight more than once or twice in a single level before? I think this thing is supposed to be an Ouroboros, but they couldn't even make it look that cool. And while the stage is probably objectively the worst, we still have to talk about the one I hate the most, Metal Shark Players. Sweet Christmas, I don't know if I've ever played anything that hit me right in my ADHD quite as hard as this does. It takes place in a garbage compactor, the ceiling going down and then up, and you needing to find safe spaces to duck into until the coast is clear. Nothing new, other platformers have done this, including Mega Man 4 with Dustman, yet this one is particularly rough. The ceiling seems slower than most other examples, and it really makes you sit there for a few seconds once it's touched down. The safe spaces are further apart, so you can't really choose to push things but just kinda need to settle down into each and every specific spot. It's pretty much the whole level, so there's no breaks. Most long sections end with a baddie or two lurking just out of sight, ready to either plink you or make you pause to take them out, just long enough for you to get crushed and have to do it all over again. In some parts you have to duck, and if you stop holding down, you stand up and get crushed, because I guess X's legs are a lot stronger than his back and neck. And for the second half, they have conveyor belts that pull you back the way you came. That's right, dragging out this stage with a slow-moving crusher with limited time frames to progress wasn't enough. They had to throw in something to try and literally pull you back with. And a lot of these stages have elements that seem designed to waste your time and drag things out, but this is by far the most egregious. Then you get the gate stages. The start of the first one is covered in spikes and seems designed for the shadow armor, though the right loadout with the another armor will let you pass through. Then there's a bunch of congested hallways with enemies from previous games to remind you of better times, and then a really boring scrolling section, though those tend to be low points in most games. In Stage 2, there are a ton of enemies, several spikes, and a lot of platforming, but don't worry, the shadow armor destroys this section and the mid-boss, so you're cool. Or you would be, if the second half of the stage wasn't designed to be beaten with anything other than shadow. There's several spots that require the air dash, one of the things that this one's lacking. I rage quit at this part at least once, struggling with the first part in high max only to discover how easily I could cheese it with the shadow felt huge. To have it all thrown back in my face, not being able to advance further and having to SD several times so that I could exit and come back with the proper armor set was obnoxious, to say the least. If there was some sign that you weren't supposed to use shadow armor here, or they put the impassable part first before you got too far in, that would have made things acceptable. As for me, I continued to be stubborn, looked up a loadout that would allow me to cheese that stage with shadow, and beat the game the way I wanted to. Screw you, Capcom. The last level is pretty simple, being just some enemies, pits, and spikes, with the real threat being the boss rush and final boss. And can we talk about the teleporter room? It's super tall with spread out platforms, making it a pain to climb back up to the top to refill your energy in between rounds, or even just to go from warp to warp. One room, with all the teleport pods visible and easy to reach. Seriously, Mega Man 2 perfected this. How is the level design so bad in this game that it screws up a basic concept they had down over 10 years before? Compounding all this, we have nightmare phenomena and alternate paths. The first are obstacles the gate activates after you beat a boss or two and will appear in stages highlighted in red on the select screen. Despite the cool sounding name though, they are all boring, throwing in extra blocks, patches of ice, or obscuring the screen other than where a few searchlights filter across. The closest one to interesting are those odd, small bugs that continuously respawn to get in your way, and that should be a pretty big indicator of what these things are. Not a well thought out and balanced bit of extra challenge, but a huge annoyance. Each actively makes every crappy stage actively worse. like they were trying to make the game as miserable as possible. Vision's already obscured by rain, let's make everything dark other than a few rays of light. The trash compactor already a bit lacking in spots to hide out, let's throw in blocks to cut down on safe spaces even more. Already frustrated waiting for the avalanches to go by in the Arctic stage? What if enemies also spawned in right beside the player to get a cheap hit in? It's a neat idea that is so poorly implemented that it somehow manages to make the bad worse. And just in case you're thinking you can just avoid choosing a level that's currently red, some of these start showing up, with or without your consent, as you get further into the game. There is no escape. Then there's the alternate paths. Find a blue portal, enter, and get taken to an alternate version of the stage with an optional boss at the end. First time, fight the Zero Nightmare to unlock Zero. Second time, fight High Max for a chance to unlock gate stages early. From then on, it's Dynamo to get some extra Nightmare souls. While I cringe at the idea of having to play through a stage a second time to actually take down the regular boss and get their weapon, I do love getting the option to unlock some bonuses and maybe even wrap up the game early, so I can't hate this concept. Or I wouldn't if not for one little detail. In Metal Shark Player's stage, there's an optional path that you can only get through with the blade armor, and going down a ladder instead will trap you in a room with one of these portals. This is actually the proper way to go, the problem is that this confuses the issue. Rather than an alternate way for the player to take to challenge themselves, this now makes you question whether this optional route is actually an option. There's nothing to distinguish this portal from all the others, so now you're left with the possibility that maybe these things are actually the way you want to go forward. And this is the only instance where it's like this, so it's baffling why they couldn't keep things consistent. It's almost like they had a quota to make sure every idea they had at least one screw up to tank the whole thing. And continuing the trend, a lot of the boss battles are pretty bad. The intro boss is kinda boring, but it's the first stage, so it's fine. Commander Yanmark is fine. Wolffang is fine. Maginian can have too much stuff on screen at once, from himself, to his clones, to the bubbles he pops out, to his actual attacks, and they sometimes get replenished faster than you can remove them. Scarovic rolls bigger and bigger poops out at you that you have to jump over so you can shoot him in the back. It's boring and easy to the point where I question if I'm missing something, like maybe I'm locking him into a pattern and not letting him use his full range of attacks. Shield Sheldon actually isn't bad, I just wish his room was a little bigger so I had more space to dodge his one attack where he puts the reflectors up and tries to float into you. Metal Shark Player uses trash to create doppelgangers of some Sinestro Mavericks, so he gets a pass due to nostalgia. Blaze Heatniks covers about half the room with lava fire, which won't kill you in one hit but is still a pain to navigate, and the reduced dodging room is the only thing that keeps him from being a total pushover. Rainy Turtloid is annoying. You have to break the crystals on his back to open him up to damage, which is a neat gimmick, but he spams an obnoxious amount of missiles while you do so. He'll also go into his shell and either roll across the floor or up and around the whole room, and given his massive size, you don't really have a lot of time to figure out which option he'll choose. For the most part though, you can outdamage each of them, so even the terrible ones could be worse, but I still wouldn't call most of them fun. And then there's the fortress bosses, where things get really obnoxious. Nightmare Mother is made up of two squares with eyeballs, reminiscent of the Devil series. They'll take up opposite corners and travel around the room typically counterclockwise, but sometimes they'll swap to clockwise, before each picking a random corner and exposing their eyes to attack you. I'm not really a fan, but I could see how others might be. In my mind, it feels kind of random, whether they'll follow the established patterns, and whether when they go into their vulnerable phase, if they'll actually be in a position that can be counterattacked, but conversely, you could say that they keep the players on their toes and requires them to make the most of it when things do fall into place. This was where my Zero run ended. Then there's Hymax, which might be the worst boss in the entire series. To hurt him, you have to stun him with a charge shot, then hit him with a special weapon. I kinda like the concept since the more bosses you defeated, the more options you have for taking him out. You refill ammo upon death, so you're not likely to run out, especially considering that you don't need just one specific weapon, and it encourages you to try different ones. It kinda falls apart in execution. The two steps drag the fight out. If he's losing, he can throw a hissy fit and start firing out death balls rapidly, making the window to counterattack brief, and in the gate stage rematch, he gets shields, which can be tricky to take down, and a lot of times, when you do, he'll immediately reactivate them because everything is meaningless, life is pointless, we're all just waiting to die. But the biggest thing to me is that the game actively lies to you. Beat the intro boss, Hymax shows up and you can do nothing to him. They have effectively taught you that the Buster is useless, yet, when you face him again, hitting him with a charge shot is the first step towards getting some damage in. All they needed to do was let a charge shot stun him in the first encounter, and that would have taught the player that, while they couldn't hurt him with it, it at least did something and they might just be missing a step. But no, instead your Buster does nothing. Don't bother using it. What do you mean you didn't realize you had to hit him with a charge shot to make him vulnerable? And yeah, it's easy enough to stumble onto this while you're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, and you can always look up a walkthrough. The fact still remains, though, that the game establishes that your shots are useless, only to expect you to piece together how vital they are in the heat of the moment. I hate this guy. Oh, and with Zero, you need to hit him with a special to make him vulnerable, then a regular attack, though the air spin counts as a standard one. Then there's Gate, the other contender for worst in the series. To hurt him, you need to use his attacks against him, busting up the portals he throws out to send a blast back at him. And once again, I love this in theory, but not in execution. His boss room has no floor, just a bunch of platforms that are asymmetrically placed. He has 3 attacks, sending out portals, flying in your direction, and once he gets to half health, doing a vertical strike that destroys platforms temporarily. When you destroy his portals, he needs to be at the proper height and distance to get caught by it. If you do too much damage to them, it destroys the projectiles, and if you do too little, extra projectiles will come your way. It can be a little hard to get right, and if you don't commit enough, the portals have annoying effects like screwing up gravity, causing slowdown, or shooting out attacks or enemies. This was easily the biggest stumbling block last playthrough, taking me around 45 minutes to clear, and the worst part of it were those 3 attack patterns. Sure, getting caught on the strewn about platforms and doing either too much or not enough damage to Gate's attacks was frustrating, but the fact that he can just not send out anything for you to send back at him and just continually float at you draws things out a lot and is super irritating, since that means that the pace is set entirely by him and whether he'll give you a chance to actually do damage to him is up to him. The whole thing just feels very clumsily implemented and half-baked. The Sigma battles are okay. The first has some pretty hard to dodge attacks, but it goes down pretty quick, so hit him hard and you'll be fine. The second one is kinda weird. Another one that puts a lot on screen and some attacks are big and quick, so you can take some cheap hits, but the smaller enemies he spawns drop health, so as long as you aren't stupid, you can hang in there. Both seem kinda messy, but they're tolerable. You ever play a game that's hard but it doesn't feel intentional? That's pretty much X6 in a nutshell. It's hard to get some upgrades without the right RNG. It's hard to follow along with the story. It's hard to know how to deal with Hymax and Gate. It's hard to have the patience needed to navigate the garbage compactor and avalanches. It's hard to take the time to go back and collect the shadow armor pieces after finally assembling the blade armor. It's hard to deal with areas that seem to have more enemies and obstacles than solid ground. It's hard to figure out which chips and armor combos will actually let you clear something. It's hard to sell yourself on playing the level twice to do both paths and get all the power-ups. It's hard to put up with unfair enemy placement. It's hard not to just reach over and press the damn power button. The game is just overall hard, but not challenging. Obnoxious is the word I'd use. Rather than being something to test the player's skill, every stumbling block in this game feels like something either implemented very incompetently, or like something cheap thrown in to give the illusion of challenge, such as too much on screen at once or an enemy placed exactly where the player needs to go, but only showing up once they're already moving. There are 3 things worth noting though. The first is what I already mentioned, about you not losing checkpoints as long as you press continue. This essentially gives you infinite tries, as long as you don't want to pop over to another stage to try and snag something else that might help. You also get your ammo refilled when you spawn back in, so you don't need to worry about conserving. Second, you seem to take much less damage than in many of the other X titles, so with all the bullcrap they're going to throw at you, you're likely going to get hit more, but you can also stand to get hit more. Maybe this was their way of balancing things, but I still find it annoying. I'd rather a manageable number of enemies to either blast through or dance around and take appropriate damage for failing than this, but at least it's not as bad as it could have been. Third, there are cheat codes. There was one armor I didn't mention earlier, and you might have even noticed something funny with some of the footage I've been using. Type in a code before starting the game and you get ultimate armor for X. As always, this functions like the 4th armor, with his air dash, hover, charge shots leaving behind plasma balls, and unlimited use of the Nova Strike. This last bit lets you blow through loads of enemies and gives you some iframes that can get you around some obstacles. And while the other armors are still better in certain scenarios, you can use some of these functions to cheese some things meant for Blade or Shadow, like Nova striking over large gaps or Hover to float over spikes meant to be walked over. This was how I did my second playthrough, and it made it almost bearable. Almost. Trash Compactor, the Wheel sub-boss, and Gate made sure I didn't get too close to having fun. I only required the jumper chip to get through the stage meant for Shadow armor. This is how I would recommend all first-timers play through the game. If the game doesn't seem too bad with the ultimate armor and you have something to prove by not using a cheat, the Blade, Shadow, and Zero will be there for subsequent runs. And speaking of Zero, there's a second code that gives you Black Zero, once you manage to unlock him. This gives him a general buff to his skills, so while not as good as the ultimate armor, it's still nice to have. When it comes to visuals, not too much has changed from the last two games. The sprite work for the main characters look the same if they're not just straight up ported over, and since I find them pleasant enough, I won't complain. There are also some drawn stills for some of the cutscenes. I'd say they look a little cheap, but hey, they weren't exactly the main focus, and I might be romanticizing how sharp manga and anime look from that era. While I'm not a fan of the story, I'll at least admit that they beat simple text boxes. When it comes to the actual character designs and some of the stage aesthetics, this is another one of the game's rare strong points. I love how Turtloid looks like some sort of robotic Gamera and how that's paired with his dreary Japanese background. I love the contrast between Tiny Maginian, as well as all his small details, and the giant Metabot he keeps hanging around in the background of his stage. Yanmark has beautiful eyes, and despite my hate of them as bosses, Hymax and Gate both have really nice designs. Hymax is large and intimidating, but with a color scheme that makes me think of a butler, suitable of his role as Gate's servant. And does anybody else think that his horns are reminiscent of Anubis ears? The shields he puts out during his final fight certainly look like they contain hieroglyphics. Gate's appearance is pretty simple starting out. Just the regular Reploid, but I love the color purple and lab coats his fashion. This also helps his ornate gold armor stand out more, with his billowing white cape taking the place of his billowing white lab coat, to make sure that no one confuses the two forms as different characters. If the game were fun to play, this might actually be one of my favorite roster of bad guys. The OST in this one actually kinda ticks me off. This game is such a dumpster fire. I've been telling you the things I hate about it for the past 30 minutes almost. There are very few nice things I have to say about it, and then it has the nerve to have a soundtrack that goes this hard. They go crazy with the guitar in Blaze Heatnik's stage. The music for Infinity Maginians is epic, one of my favorites in the series, giving me Final Countdown vibes. Blizzard Wolffangs, while much more subdued, is still a mood and in a better game would instill me with a sense of determination. While I could probably pick out a few that are just merely okay, the vast majority of the tracks are just certifiable bangers. When I was streaming the game, I mentioned how at least the music was good, and someone in chat said about how it was one of the best in the series, and I found myself kinda cheesed that I couldn't disagree with them. This music is wasted on this title, and I need to know how they got almost everything else wrong, yet somehow managed to raise the bar when it came to the tunes. Life is so unfair. I contend that X6 is not just the worst X title, but also the worst Mega Man game, though this is a bit of a contentious opinion. Most would give it to X7, and I can certainly see their point. Heck, there's a fair chance you could even convince me that it's worse mechanically, but given the wider context of Mega Man as a whole, I'd say this one does a few things that are unforgivable. First off, this is undeniably a Mega Man game. It doesn't try something new and manage to feel more like a spin-off than a mainline title. You'll look at this one and you think, that's X. The mechanics are there, the graphics are very similar to the last two titles, and there's a lot of comparisons you can draw. Like what I mentioned before between Dustman and Metal Shark Player stages, yet even with having all that to draw on, having a long and celebrated history to get inspiration from, this game manages to fail at even all the stuff it apes. It's almost like they were trying to prove that Mega Man could be awful, swiping all the series templates and twisting them until they were nigh unplayable. The second thing, which might manage to be even worse somehow, is that it forced the series that had reached a natural conclusion to continue, sloppily walking back plot points to re-establish the previous status quo. If they had kept things going in a more natural direction, it might have been more forgivable. Or if they had just something that they still wanted to do with the series, something profound to say, or some amazing level or boss designs that they didn't get around to using yet, that might have been fine too, but instead, they pushed out this absolute turd of a title. It feels akin to digging up a corpse and attaching puppet strings to it, to parade it around and make some pocket change. This game is blasphemy, and while X7 is bad, it at least manages to avoid committing these atrocities. I'm going to take things one step further. I played a lot of games in my day, many objectively worse than this. I played buggy, incomplete trash. I played untested, unfair bullshit. I played games with no substance, nothing to justify their existence outside of some minimal programming training and a desire to make a buck, and yet there is no game I hate and wish I could erase from existence more than X6. This game is a complete abomination, and Capcom should be ashamed for having published it, as should Sony for letting it appear on their console. If you think that another entry deserves the title of worst, or are one of those rare souls that like X6, that's cool, that's cool. I can respect other opinions, I just need you to understand that there is no argument you could ever make to convince me that this one has a right to life. But feel free to disagree with me anyhow in the comments. For right now though, thanks for watching, maybe consider subscribing if you like Mega Man content, and I think I'm gonna go lie down for the next few days.